Dave, when you are. Okay, welcome back. Thanks a lot for sticking around for the live stream. For those of you who have any questions online, and maybe for those that were submitted during any of the presentations, just want to let you know, out here in Breckenridge, temperature's still in the low 20s. The sun has come out, and it's a beautiful day here. We're going to be spending this week informing you of all of the latest research related to extreme weather and climate change impacts, and vulnerabilities. So please check the website at www.stormcenter.com/WXC Summit, and that'll take you right to the website where you can check out the agenda. So what we're going to do now is we're going to ask some questions from you online of our morning speakers, Dr. Lora Koenig from the University of Colorado, the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and Dr. Tim Brown, who is the director of the Western Regional Climate Center at the Desert Research Institute. So I'm going to turn the questions over to Cheryl Nelson, who's our social media meteorologist and expert, who's captured a few questions online, and we'll just take it as it rolls. If you think of anything, just please ask, and we'll continue the question and answer dialogue. One thing I do want to mention is that Dr. Koenig is leaving rather quickly this afternoon to fly back to Washington, D.C. because they have an Operation Icebridge meeting there, and hopefully she'll be able to get out of Washington, D.C. After a potential major snowstorm is threatened to hit there. So please join us also tomorrow morning as Dale Eck from the Weather Channel, the director of the Global Weather Forecast Center, will be giving us a in-depth weather briefing tomorrow morning beginning at 8 a.m. Mountain Time, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cheryl.
From our online audience. And Laura, this question is for you. And this is actually a particular interest for me as well, as I live in the Virginia Beach area of Virginia. And the question is, how quickly do you think the coastline will begin to flood from sea level rise?
So, as the ice sheets release, you think that right now we're talking about 3 millimeters a year, so it's not a lot. It actually will increase, relatively gradually during that time. And when we talk about sea level rise, so you have sea level rise, which is important, and that's your sort of background, the level as it comes up. But when they talk about catastrophic events from sea level rise, they're really talking about, it's not just that the sea level has come up a little bit, but when you have these major events, hurricanes and storm surges and things like that, it rises those up even more. And it really matters, if your levee is this tall, that last little bit is what matters the most. So even if it's rising slowly, you really want to be looking at your infrastructure and where you are on how that rise is coming up for your infrastructure.
Follow-up question to that. Do you think people along the U.S. coastline should be taking more measures to better their infrastructure and consider how they're building differently with codes and whatnot?
Yeah, I would certainly say it's a very prudent to think about how sea level will rise in the future, and there are many engineering solutions for that, and be prudent in how you build and how you choose to do that with sea levels that will be rising.
Attendees here. As a follow-up to the questions there, I remember David Titley talking about southeastern Virginia, not only with sea level rise, also with the subsidence that's going on there. But a broader question was, I'm more familiar too with what's called nuisance flooding, when the Weather Service issues these flood advisories, flood warnings, and the increases, especially in my region, and I think Annapolis, Baltimore, and Washington were 3 of the top 10 of the last 50 years for the increases in nuisance flooding. Do you think we're going to see a lot more, and I imagine the answer is obviously, of this nuisance flooding, or are they going to have to change the criteria because there's going to be a new norm, a new baseline as sea level comes up?
Yeah, and from my expertise being snow and ice, we can just say that, we're losing ice that was on land. When we lose it on land, it goes into the oceans, and it has to continue to rise. So we'll see this sea level rise and how that relates to more nuisance flooding and different things like that. Sea level is going to come up.
And a separate question, there have been schemes to mitigate this, covering glaciers with big white insulative sheets or anything. Do you have any thoughts about any practical or impractical mitigation that could be done using today's technology to slow the pace of melt?
I think what we should be looking for the most is that, like when we talked about the Greenland ice sheet, it has some capacity to act like a sponge and delay some of the sea level rise, but it's not occurring. Our measurements are showing that it's not in our observations. So yeah, if you were going to try geoengineering solutions, these are very, very large ice sheets. So I don't think we're going to actually be able to mitigate them just because of their size. When people talk about some of those geoengineering solutions, they could talk about maybe one watershed and one glacier, and that might be more manageable. But the ice sheets are, Antarctica is 1.5 times the size of the United States, so that's a lot of area to try and do geoengineering over.
Okay. Oh, one final thought for you, just because I live in the D.C. area. There's a professor, I think it's Licht or Light, over at George Washington University, and he came up with a technique to basically harvest carbon dioxide or sequester it out of the atmosphere to make carbon nanotubes. He thinks this is like the infancy, like when plastics was just getting going, that this will be the next great thing. But he thinks ramped up enough, it could actually reduce and be a nice way to clean CO2 out of the atmosphere. You familiar with any of that?
I'm not, but again, it's the CO2 that's rising the temperatures over the ice sheets. So any mitigation efforts we can do on CO2, some changes already in the ice sheets. They are slower to respond because they're a large ice mass. But any mitigations to CO2 will help.
And I guess with Tim Brown with the fire situation, if we could mitigate that, we'd be winning on both fronts, right?
Yes, definitely. So again, I encourage folks to interact and work with their fire-wise communities and try and better understand, the fire environment that they live in and what they can do, with their own homes and communities.
I'm going to keep going with you since I got a bunch of questions. When the fires were going, and I've heard the argument of let them burn, just let them burn. They'll get rid of the fuel. It's a natural thing. Pine needles come out due to fire. So, fire isn't not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, where do we find the balance of, as you were talking about the human factor earlier in your talk versus, what's a naturally occurring thing that, we should learn to live with?
Well, there may be some forest situations in which we may have to let it burn, in the sense that if the fuels are so heavy, firefighting will be difficult, again, for that firefighter safety reason. Mechanical treatments could be undertaken, but that's can be expensive and very time-consuming. Prescribed fire, again, if the fuels are so heavy, you might not be able to meet the management objective that you're trying to meet. I mean, there's certainly some risk with prescribed fire. I don't know, lost my additional thought on that, I guess.
Cheryl Nelson with Storm Center, and this question coming from social media. And this is for Dr. Brown again. Are wildfires expected to break out more on the East Coast? And if so, why?
I'm not. Well, the East Coast, the Southeast, I think, for sure. The Northeast is known to have wildfires, for sure. In fact, in the early history, the Adirondack region had very large fires of 1 million or more acres. So it's not unheard of. Long Island had a fire in the 90s that was big, for that area. So if we have a warming climate and a drying climate in the east, then yes, we can expect to see more fire. And one of the things about the east that's different from the west, you can get fire over a shorter time period. So in other words, you could have a heavy, wet precipitation event, but it could only take a couple, 3 days for it to dry out enough because there's so much ground litter that fire could really take off.
Thank you. So follow up to that, and this is of particular interest to myself. I live in the southeastern Virginia area, and several years ago, the Great Dismal Swamp in Chesapeake caught on fire, and that was mainly because of the peat moss. What can you talk to me about that, and does that relate to everything else we've discussed today?
Yes, so given drying conditions, this peat is not just in the area that you're talking about. We're talking about globally these large areas of peat. And there's some real challenges there. First of all, it's very difficult to put out that type of a fire. That was one of the main issues in Indonesia, that they had these thick layers of duff and peat were burning. You can pour gallons and gallons of water on it. It's still difficult to do that. Also, this gets back to climate change, right? These peat areas are contain carbon. So if, it's a sink for the carbon. And so if we have a lot of fire in these areas, then we can have atmospheric release of carbon.
Tim, one quick follow-up, Howard, confirmed to the end of USA TV. We hear about the potential melting of the permafrost. And it would make sense to me that if that happens, then we'd have more available fuel to burn.
Yes.
In the short term, yeah. Okay.
Yes. Well, that's
thanks
right.
for confirming my thought.
That's right. And again, this is part of what's going on in the boreal regions. And so it's part of this, climate change feedback process. The Arctic regions are warming, more quickly than, say, mid-latitudes or, tropic regions. And so this is allowing the opportunity for the permafrost melting and then subsequent fire and more intense and larger fires in the boreal regions.
Hi, it's a question for Laura. Jennifer Francis again, Rutgers University. You showed that the surface melting on Greenland, we know, is expanding in its extent. Do you have a sense for where the largest uncertainties are in determining what is causing it and the variability from year to year, whether it's dynamic in terms of changing atmospheric patterns or whether it's more about thermodynamics and things like clouds and water vapor in the atmosphere?
So I think that's a very good question, and I don't think I have the answer to it, but it's a combination of all of those things. There was a report out in Nature Communications, I believe, just this week on cloud cover over Greenland, and that the increasing in cloud cover is actually through the nighttime not allowing the long-wave radiation to escape, and that the melt seen during the day is continuing into the night, and that's causing a warming. What we do know in the models, too, is that there's a lot of discrepancy between the cloud cover. So there's a lot of it's a complicated thing that's causing the warming over Greenland, both the albedo of the ice, the amount of clouds, and then the atmospheric warming. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done on which of those are dominating.
Yeah, I have one more question online. This is Cheryl with Storm Center, and this is for Dr. Koenig. Tell me, does NASA put any of their videos online, and can we follow up on the ice bridge?
Yeah, that's a great question. So NASA has this amazing resource called the Scientific Visualization Studios. So not just on ice, but on any scientific topic. I encourage you to go there. You can search off of your scientific topic and see a lot of the animations and stories that NASA has put together with their data. So check that out. Operation Icebridge, nasa.gov/icebridge is the website. There is a lot of content there, as well as NASA Ice, at NASA Ice Twitter feed. Those are all great places to go, and I cannot emphasize enough how great the Scientific Visualization Studio videos are as a resource.
Okay, great. Thank you both very much.
This has been terrific. Thanks so much. We've gotten some online questions and some questions here from our attendees, broadcast meteorologists as well. So Dr. Koenig and also Dr. Brown, thanks so much for joining us here at the Glenn Gerberg Weather and Climate Summit. I know there are some other broadcasters that are going to be interviewing both of these scientists right after we sign off here. So the day is not over, and I know that Dr. Koenig is going to be flying back to Washington. So safe travels there. We'll see all of you back here tomorrow morning. Please share on social media the address to join the live stream, and also send out tweets to all of your followers to join us here tomorrow morning as we continue the Glenn Gerberg Weather and Climate